is that Palestinians actually never had a state. There was no like historic Palestine formation whatsoever, and that it was under Ottoman mandate and then British mandate, and the British offered Israelis the entire area known as Israel, including the West Bank and Gaza. And Israelis actually did a really nice gesture to the Palestinians by giving them Gaza and the West Bank. Okay, here, let's start the video call, and let's start it. Let's get right into it. Hold on. Let me deactivate my camera and activate it in the... Hello. 1 second. What's good?
Not much, hanging out. Actually, Brendan and I are on a Blowback Season 5 planning retreat.
Nice, nice, nice. It's good to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, here is... Wait, hold on. Let me pop this out real quick. Let me pop this so everybody can see your beautiful face. Ladies and gentlemen, boys, girls, and bees, here is Noah Kulwin of the Blowback Podcast. He is going to, alongside myself, look at some of the Hasbara trolling ops that was dished out, titled effectively "How to Have Conversations About Israel on College Campuses." We will also be looking at a lot more. Noah, before we get started, because of course everyone is going to immediately call you a Hamas supporter and an anti-Semite, do you want to give people that maybe are unfamiliar your Jewish bona fides?
Sure. So I am a contributing editor at Jewish Currents. And for people who are still looking to get more information on the conflict, the Jewish Currents team has been doing terrific work on a still updating explainer series that I highly recommend. And I have reported from Israel and Palestine, and I've also written extensively on these issues for some time, both for Jewish Currents and other publications. And yeah, I mean, my Hebrew's pretty good, and I lived there once upon a time. I actually lived in southern Israel. And have spent a decent amount of time in the places that a lot of people have been seeing footage from. And it's, I mean, fairly brain breaking, to say the least.
Yeah, a lot of brains have been broken, but then also simultaneously, I feel like American media, Western media has reacted in an incredibly predictable fashion, and I think that is by design. This is part of the reason why we want to look at some of this propaganda, because a lot of people come in here and hit us with some talking points. Ben Shapiro, I think I was texting you about this earlier. Ben Shapiro had a very viral TikTok/tweet of mine on his show that he featured, where he said I was a moral idiot or something, and immediately said that I actually personally love decapitating babies, you know, things of that nature. It's pretty basic stuff. Do you have an opinion on the media repeating unverified, unsubstantiated claims without ever, you know, offering a second thought to it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there are multiple levels to the phenomenon that you're describing. I think one level that's very, kind of basic and frankly pretty overlooked is that a lot of the reports about, the many real atrocities visited upon Israelis in the last few days, and a lot of the fake ones, they're being described and formatted into, fairly familiar stereotypes, frankly, about Arab savages and brown men raping white women.
A racist canard.
Exactly. And so I think that is a very easy and familiar framing for people to make sense of what they are, what it is that they're seeing. So that's thing number one. And then thing number two is that, the Israeli government, in a lot of the media that's circulating, I mean, now it's become, you can look at the New York Times and they have articles about how, like false claims are undermining the integrity of trying to talk about like the real atrocities. So it's already, the proliferation of, inflated accounts and yes, minimized accounts, but like, the proliferation of truly, outrageous claims like that babies were decapitated en masse. It's been I think it sort of clearly serves to try and justify, at the very least, what Israel is doing at this very second, which is, pummeling and brutalizing Gaza to the point of, extermination. And then I think sort of the final level of this is that there's a game that was played in the media after 9/11 that was called Do You Condemn? And the Do You Condemn game is meant to eliminate and erase what is actually the fundamental American political subjectivity, right? Like what is actually, as an American, as a person who's, as political agents in the world, as people who are trying to think, well, what are the moral responsibilities that I have, to this conflict? Like what we can do? Well, Hamas murdered civilians, and the reports of it indicate that it was cold-blooded and cruel. But American taxpayer dollars do not pay for Hamas's Katyusha rockets, except in the sense that we pay for Israel's military, and Hamas steals their supplies from Israel or is given aid directly by Israel for stabilization purposes. But I digress.
Yeah, I was going to say our tax dollars have definitely contributed to Hamas being seen as the responsible party or responsible for Palestinian upkeep in general.
And we are, clearly the point I'm trying to make is that like we're the patrons of Israel, and so we have as a kind of immediate, influence on the, setting aside even the fact that Israel does have complete political control over events on the ground at the moment. Like they do. It's the responsibility begins and lies with them. This is they claim that this is territory that is under their control. They take responsibility for what happens in it. This includes the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, what is the Israeli government calls Judea and Samaria. It's their obligation. And I think that we are, lost my train of thought with the Hamas digression there. But I do think that to the point about the Hamas, trying to get back on track. Hamas's ability, the Do You Condemn game is sort of about trying to make it clear that like our relationship to Hamas is not at all about, or obscuring that it is not at all like our relationship to Israel, because we do not support Hamas in the same way that we support Israel. If we want to have influence as political actors and help and actually trying to get American politicians, whether it's AOC or Lindsey Graham, who's calling for a war on Islam, it looks like, to actually do something productive, or the State Department, that's what our capacity is for. But we don't really have the position, it's sort of, I think, an acknowledgement of our inability to influence as Americans our foreign policy so concretely that we are instead, the media has become, and I think it also obviously serves the interests of people who, are very clearly aggressively pro-Israel and support the Israeli government. But they want us to we're just having discourse about discourse, and whether or not people providing explanations for why Hamas did something or why an event happened are in fact making excuses for it, or whether or not somebody said an annoying thing at a protest or somebody said something online. Yeah. And it's just misdirection. Can
I cut in here for 1 second?
Yeah, please. I'm done.
So I have been talking about the Mia Khalifa stuff and everything else that has accompanied the Palestinian forces entering Israel, and the double standard, of course. It's one that I know very well, being Muslim and living in America in a post 9/11 universe. One where if you are in any way, shape, or form, interested in analyzing where this violence begins, you are, especially as a Muslim person, you are immediately asked to condemn the terrorism, condemn the violence, and it is, I think, a way to bog down the conversation. It's a way to just shut off the conversation, because a lot of people come in here and say, oh, you love babies being decapitated, it seems. And it's if I sit there and go, this might be a real news story. I am not completely sure, but it is certainly frustrating to me that the IDF refuses to verify said claims, or yada, yada, yada. All of a sudden, I'm in a defensive posture talking about like whether or not babies' heads were chopped off, when in fact like a massacre still occurred, right? Like that part is real. And if your goal is to ensure that Israeli citizens are not being murdered, if your goal is to ensure that Palestinians are not being murdered and ruthlessly being subjects of an apartheid regime that necessitates violence, right? Then you have to look at this from a broader lens and not hyper focus on whether or not whichever way babies were murdered, basically, right? I think Lib Crusher, weird to mention a name like that when we're talking about such serious subject matters, put it aptly here. He said, I don't know where their kids were beheaded, but it seems pretty clear now that there were wholesale massacres near the Gaza border, and I have no reason to doubt kids are among the victims. Doesn't make you a squish on Palestinian liberation to acknowledge it. Gaza simply can't be more surveilled, more deprived, more isolated than it already has been, short of outright genocide. Millions of Gazans have paid a horrific price for this futile, delusional strategy. Now thousands of Israelis have too. Gazans have been subjected to endless surveillance, humiliation, and inherently indiscriminate bombing, blockades, and deprivation of the most basic necessities of human life for decades now, all in the name of security for Israelis. What's the justification now? Do you agree with that? I don't know. I'm saying that.
Yeah,
like,
I think it's right. I think that what I just always hesitate about is that, I think that, like, again, after 9/11, the Do You Condemn game was made to make people answer for, as if that they were, if you support Palestinian resistance, and if you support, like that, you are made to answer for, like, the justice of the cause is compromised by the excesses of people for whom you're not accountable for. Yeah. And who don't, whose actions do not undermine the integrity of that cause if you seriously believe it. Exactly. And that's where, like, I just don't, like, I agree, like, it doesn't make you a squish, but, like, I do think that there is, it's just disturbing to see how many people's loyalty cards are being demanded to be shown, to show that, like, we still have a conscience, and that we're actually, we condemn the indiscriminate murder of children in spite of what some hotheads said on Twitter. I just don't think that that's, like, it just, like, I'm not, and frankly, I'll say this, like, it's a very effective rhetorical tactic at this moment. Yeah. But we don't know a ton about what's happening in Gaza because they have no power. Exactly. Many people are running out, like, and they get power for the limited number of people that are able to get solar energy during the day that can supply, a very limited amount. So we're on, like, a really limited, we're limited. We have there's a limited amount of information that we are getting about what is going on in Gaza specifically, and I think that means that we are, I don't know, like, it's just difficult for people to even, like, see or acknowledge the, like, like, the vastness of what the Israeli, both what Israel's, what the Israeli operation seems to be underway now. The speech that apparently Benny Gantz, the former general who has been invited into the unity government or war cabinet, if you want to call it that, he's like, he previously ran for prime minister as both, like, the principal opposition to Bibi, but, I'm sure, as many of your listeners know or viewers know, he also ran a campaign ad bragging about bombing Gaza back to the Stone Age. Yeah,
he literally put his war crimes up. He posted his war crimes to be like, vote for me. Like, I'm no fucking, die in the wool, bleeding heart libtard. I promise. Like, I will also do war crimes, which I was given a medal for. Awesome.
Yeah. It's, and look, there are even reports, and it's been a tactic in the past. We saw the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh from Al Jazeera. And, like, the Israeli press, the Israeli military has killed the press. And so there is also, I think, a degree to which we don't see what's going on in Gaza because Israel it's not just because, like, Israel's deprived power and stuff. It's that Israel's not letting foreign press in because they control who gets to go in and out. And also, they've racked up a fair number of media bodies themselves. A number of Palestinian journalists in the West Bank, I saw photos of this already, have been protesting the murder of Gazan journalists. It's awful top to bottom. I also think one of the other things, one thing that is worth adding to this is that the Israeli public is pretty shattered in a way that I think is not quite coming through in English language media and in English language Twitter.
Oh yeah.
The Israeli public is really, I mean, it's been very divided and quite polarized for some time. You know, you could argue really since like, you know, it's like the latest era of Israeli politics was inaugurated in 2009 with the first election, rather the second election of Netanyahu. And I would, you know, I think that there is a, you know, like the era of that consensus is possibly cracking within Israel. And it may, you know, create an opening that hasn't existed previously because of the far right's increasing control over so much of the country, for this kind of, you know, more geopolitically minded kind of centrist bloc to take control. You know, and that's been a policy drift that's been sort of made impossible within Israel, something that you could be called, let's say, like an accommodationist wing, since Rabin was assassinated, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated in the 1990s.
So that's actually
the last dovish Israeli prime minister.
Yeah. So I do wanna you bring up a good point about Yitzhak Rabin, because I specifically want to talk about something that I find to be particularly interesting. Now, obviously, Yitzhak Rabin was largely hailed as like the last Israeli leader that actually wanted to even negotiate with Palestinians in good faith and like treat them as humans. And yet he still was, of course, a Zionist and absolutely was not genuinely interested in like having, to my understanding, having the same amenities for Palestinians, significantly better than the current Israeli position. That would be a major compromise that many Israelis probably would not even agree with at this point, as far as I understand. And yet, what was it? A state minus? What was the sentiment?
The idea. Yeah, I mean, the idea was essentially that, like, you know, Rabin is credited. You know, the Oslo process is initiated, and there's this, you know, very like the Oslo process was like a failure. And I think Palestinian activists and scholars and, you know, have really argued and sort of completely put to bed any idea that like the Oslo process was anything other than just like arresting the development of Palestinian resistance from the time of the First Intifada in the early 90s. The thing with Rabin, though, and sort of what his death speaks to is not so much about like, well, you know, could Rabin have been, you know, a kind of like, let's say, Israeli Mandela to invert pretty, you know, a racist. Like, I mean, you know, I think that he could have been a, you know, maybe more like a de Gaulle kind of figure, because he had founding father credibility from having been a man in uniform at a very young age in the early days of the state. And he was also, I mean, you know, he recognized in a meaningful way the necessity of Jews and Palestinians to live like that basically the thing that really accelerated after he died, and it's a meaningful contribution to why we're in the specific situation that we're in today, was that Rabin, you know, the settlement enterprise that exploded after him completely undermined any ability for Jews and Palestinians to live side by side. The separation barrier that was erected roughly along the border of the Green Line. I say roughly because it also stole tons of land from Palestinians in a more direct theft than the original 48 theft. The, you know, security barrier sort of, you know, helped consecrate that and sort of contribute and reify even more concretely that Palestinians and Jews were now to be living in separate and pretty much in permanently unequal conditions, sort of calcifying the apartheid. So I think when we talk about Rabin, the kind of thing that's helpful to consider is that, like, what has been absent in the almost 30 years since his death is the idea of a leader of Israel who is actually willing to make concessions. Yeah. And now that the Palestinians have, demonstrated that they can threaten, again, Israel's geopolitical basic calculus, right? Like the Hamas revolt in Gaza, complemented by, the threats from Houthis in Yemen and the, Hezbollah's, the quote unquote Hezbollah menace or threat in southern Lebanon, although it seems pretty clear that Hezbollah has not, as of yet, not gotten involved.
Just some
it's,
back and forth
the basic
artillery
security
shelling.
calculus on Israel is now totally been jeopardized. That one other important point that's been kind of lost in everything going on today, that the Hamas attack and the murder of civilians is very, very ugly, but the Israeli public is shattered. And they may turn to somebody like that again because, like a Robin figure again, because the basic security calculus that was constructed since his death has now been challenged, meaningfully challenged.
Exactly. This is really important to analyze from the framework of Benjamin Netanyahu and his increasingly reactionary coalitions that he put together. Was seen as the security candidate. This is something that was very important for Israelis, and that is what carried him beyond the shitty allegiances that he made. But that was always his, as far as I understand, that was always his selling point, that his reactionary politics were actually going to keep Israelis safe, and that fragility was demonstrated in this last Palestinian incursion, and an unimaginable, untold amount of Israeli deaths occurred. This has never happened before. It took, 3 days now of endless bombing campaigns in Gaza?
I woke up to seeing videos of, these are a lot of, and this is not what I'm saying does not apply universally. This isn't like every Israeli settlement or village is like this, and or town or city. But this, you have communities, really, these are not, and these are also, by the way, not the equivalent of West Bank settlements where they are beyond what we'll call the 67 borders. These are communities within, what would be called I don't want to I don't mean to say this in legitimating the 48 thefts, but just to describe how
I say Israel proper. I think everybody understands what you mean when you say that.
So Israel proper. And so these town, you have reservists. So in Hebrew, miluim, who are essentially, because everybody in Israel serve in the military. And then once you're done with your few years, you have designated reserve duty. And it is, historically speaking, considered more of a chore than it is a particularly, threatening or serious obligation. And so now it's you have reservists, people who probably are not particularly blooded or trained soldiers, who are trying to be, who are appealing for help. And I saw one report that blew me away this morning, where they the Army said you're on your own for a while. There's just no you're seeing a degree of breakdown that is really they may be able to recover from it. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to say that this is this necessarily means something really dramatic is going to start shifting in the current geopolitical order. But this is the biggest blow that it has taken, since 73. I think that's the appropriate comparison.
So two things I want to mention. One thing I knew about and another I did not. Two people that were involved in calling for the death of Yitzhak Rabin, who then, of course, did get assassinated, are now, of course, heads of state in Israel. I'm referencing Benjamin Netanyahu and also Ben-Gvir, which I did not know. I knew about Ben-Gvir. I did not know Netanyahu also facilitated alongside Likud Rabin is a murderer, he's a traitor, and we have to lynch him party, which the chief of internal security, Carmi Gilon, at the time alerted Netanyahu of a plot on Rabin's life and asked him to moderate the protest rhetoric, which Netanyahu declined to do. Ben-Gvir also is, directly a Kahanist terrorist, so he's done much worse shit outside of that. But this is something to understand. This is something to consider, that the one dude that maybe was supposedly going to be more definitely going to be more reasonable than the current Israeli government was assassinated, and people have been voting for those who supported his assassination over and over again. And that violent rhetoric and that violence that accompanies Israel's apartheid conditions has only intensified. And I'm sure you've seen this as well, the Shin Bet warnings on internal security and how the continued occupation or the continued apartheid conditions in the West Bank were actually going to cause security collapse, a warning that Netanyahu's government did not heed and called woke nonsense. It's not like it's not like Shin Bet, in my opinion. Perhaps I'm wrong. You can tell me if I am. It is not exactly a bunch of woke moralists when they say, hey, constantly fucking killing people in the West Bank and constantly killing people in Gaza is only radicalizing Palestinians further, which will inevitably escalate to violence that Israelis may actually see, and not the kind that many are used to, where, like, you know, handmade rockets are being intercepted by our beautiful Iron Dome, but like direct violence like the ones we saw, direct violence that we saw this past weekend.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, one thing I am sort of curious, like, about, I guess, with like a lot of the current sort of the American position as it relates to, you know, like, to this ongoing violence. There have been like a lot of, you know, people right now are still reeling from a lot of the images of the massacre in Israel. That, you know, like, particularly, you know, like the killings in the kibbutzim and the music festival. But I really do. I have been kind of wondering a lot about, you know, in the next few days and the next week, if, you know, the Israeli public has been shattered and so on. And everybody's talking very, very tough right now. But, you know, I also do wonder, and I retain open somewhat the possibility that, like, as we learn more about like what's going on, and the fact that like all of this, you know, was warned about, as you said, by people like the Shin Bet and so forth, if that will, you know, like, historically, right, like, that hasn't made a dent in the pro-Israel lobby and in the lockstep support for Israel's, you know, like,
oh no,
like
not in the Western world. Yeah, no,
and even within Israel, by the way, it's very, very difficult to fight it, because the country is so, you know, it's so hard to hold these different, you know, it's been such an unstable, kind of ungovernable mess for so long. I mean, that's why Netanyahu has been president, or prime minister for, you know, so many years, with only like, you know, one brief interruption. You know, there, like, I could see a world in which there is a kind of, yeah, like like, you see a new kind of political opening emerge as a result of the dissatisfaction. Now, the issue is that, like, you know, there is a history, actually, of Israeli ex-Shin Bet guys and others going into politics or speaking their mind. There was a movie, actually, called, not The Generals, The Gatekeeper? What was it? Israeli movie documentary. I think it was nominated for stuff. The Gatekeepers, yeah, from 2012. And it's about, like, the Shin Bet, and it's like sort of like a rip-off. It's like a styled off like an Errol Morris thing, but like it interviews a bunch of former Shin Bet leaders, and, you know, it like they've always, like, this line of critique has existed for a really long time, and it's never actually penetrated through to the Israeli, you know, political establishment, or it seems, you know, to the strategic core of Israel, because the situation keeps getting worse. So we hear a lot about, you know, the Shin Bet saying, like, actually, you know, this thing is really bad, etc. And, you know, it helps legitimate left-wingers' arguments for sure. But, like, I have to confess, like, because we've heard this story before, it does, like, ring a little bit hollow to me, because, you know, these people continue to vocalize these critiques, but, like, okay, then, you know, Netanyahu is still running the show. You know, it's like the right wingers, the inmates, are still, you know, in control of the asylum, so to speak. So, you know, is this just saving face? Is this, you know, are these consciences found too late? Is that, you know, I'm not sure. I don't feel like I could speak to that, but, like, it does strike me as, like, you know, not dissimilar. It reminds me a little bit of, like, all the, you know, the resistant CIA guys in like, when with Trump, you know, like, it's just like, it's like, you know, like, I agree with you that, like, Cheeto Man bad, but, you know, I'm not really ready to get in bed with you.
All I'm looking at here is an immediate comparison to, like, what kind of resistance occurred after 9/11, and obviously, like, it's not a one-to-one comparison because America's genocidal crimes are well within its past, and those we still the atrocities that we still commit, we do far away and not in our fucking backyard, you know. So it's a little bit different, but I don't recall a moment of clarity such that we hear from Haaretz, obviously, you know, liberals, whatever. But I don't recall that from like the New York Times in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And I think that is what I'm factoring in to see if people do truly recognize that this kind of violence is always going to continue, because there's only two ways out of it. It's obviously full-scale genocide, or it is de-escalation and genuine peace talks and peace conversations.
I mean, there's another option, which is like, you know, the one that has already happened. It just happened a long time ago, and we now need to confront whether or not our government will let it happen this time, which is expulsion, which is if they open a quote-unquote humanitarian corridor or something to
America's
let people out
pushing
of the
that
bombings.
right now, yeah. Through Egypt.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, great. We've now just, you know, and it's like we create a bunch of displaced persons camps in the middle of the fucking Sinai, which is right in by which is controlled essentially by, you know, ISIS level bandit groups. I mean, this is ridiculous. It's it would be probably the greatest American humanitarian catastrophe, outside of like a war we started. That I could ever think of. I mean, the mind boggles. You know, I do think that it's, it's, it's expulsion. It could be genocide. It could be a bit of both. It's hard to say. It could also end up being, it may end up being that like the Israeli government does not have the capacity to carry that out because, okay, they set up a humanitarian corridor and they try to expel people, and then all of a sudden Hezbollah has not, it has not yet entered the fray, but then they could or something. I think that's part of why it's, this moment is, I hesitate to draw any strong conclusions about what's about to happen aside, from when people say it, and make it clear, just because you can see, part of what makes this moment so tense, and the reason it's so legitimately tense, and that, that you can tell that existing orders feel threatened by the potential for destabilization, is because it could break so many different potential ways.
Yeah. One other thing that I wanted to bring up is sometimes you see this because the Israeli atrocities are so commonplace that you have what I like to call the Jamie Lee Curtis dilemma, where you end up showing Israeli atrocities against Palestinians while simultaneously maintaining your support for Israel, not realizing that those are Palestinian kids that are being bombed by Israeli forces.
I mean, did you see the Justin Bieber thing?
Yes, I was going to say. Justin Bieber earlier today posted a photo a call to action saying praying for Israel with interlaced with footage of the rubble that is now certain parts of Gaza. I suspect he was not praying for Israel to stop, which is what I thought he may have, I don't know, been pushing for. The other thing I wanted to show is the pregnant woman in southern Israel was found by Hamas terrorists. They dissected her body. Her stomach was cut open, and they took her fetus out with the umbilical cord and let the unborn child die slowly out of his mother's womb. This is what inhuman savages Hamas do to people. Now, you might remember that story because it was a very, very famous one, except, once again, that familiar story was not of Hamas, but vice versa. Hamas dissected a pregnant woman's body, says Mohammed El-Kurd, but it's actually a report of the Sabra and Shatila massacre where Israeli soldiers did that to a Palestinian woman. Hamas keeps babies in cages, but the images show Palestinian babies caged by the Israeli military. What a circus, says Mohammed El-Kurd.
Well, that's like, to me, the rapes narrative is like particularly kind of galling to make that claim without any really hard proof. And again, like, this is where it's like, yeah, this isn't just nitpicky cringe, like leftists or whatever being like, show the receipts for this. Like, it's like, no, actually, this is like literally shifting the locus of responsibility for the actual systematic mass sexual violations that take place as part of the administration of occupation, whether it's in Israeli prisons or it's in let's say checkpoints where Palestinians have to cross them. And there's actually a friend passed on Twitter at Tamar S, who has been a really good has honestly been a very good follow for a lot of this stuff. She passed on to me a story from the Times of Israel last year, Headline: Ex-prison guard alleges sexual assault by security inmate accused of raping soldier. New claims from another guard at Gilboa prison add to growing scandal over accusations that female wardens were, quote, pimped to Palestinian prisoners. So there's also just like, again, like it's like the depravity exists within the Israeli system in spades. And, yet we've got to resort to just buying into the like cheap and most degraded cliches about, what people bottled up in horrible conditions for decades will do. It's if you believe that these people will commit these rapes and these beheadings, like what won't they do? And combined with the very the objective like the awful crimes of civilian deaths, it ends up just it makes the actual possibility for meaningful reconciliation and fact finding that much more difficult.
Yeah. Okay. We should probably. Well, there's an update, by the way. Latest news. People are telling me that Hamas has released a woman and her children. They've released a Israeli family. I suspect this is to make it impossible for Israel to deny that there are Israeli citizens currently being bombed alongside Hamas and alongside Palestinian civilians. Because it makes it rather difficult that the current opinion of the Israeli regime seemingly has decided that these guys are collateral damage. Even Israeli citizens themselves are collateral damage that will possibly die in the bloodshed, right? So I suspect the reason for the prisoner or for the hostage release here is to make it impossible to avoid by Israeli media.
Yep.
So we'll see. Where is it? This link is not working, chatter, that you're sending me. But speaking of parsing through real information, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on today was so that we could look at like the dedicated efforts that the Israeli government has put to talking about Israel. This is the Hasbara Handbook. Hasbara, how do you say it? Hasbara Handbook, promoting Israel on campus. This is from March 2002, but a lot of the talking points are still pretty much the same. Obviously, like goals shift as Israel becomes more violent. I also
think it would be helpful to give also some context about when this House Campus Handbook was produced. Because I think that there are two sort of useful historical convergences for people to think about. So March 2002, it's the second Intifada. So the first Intifada was characterized, broadly speaking, by strikes, mass civil disobedience, stone throwing and direct confrontation with Israeli soldiers and military forces, but it was not really, they weren't targeting population centers. And then in the 2000s, after the collapse,
it's important to also analyze it within the framework of freedom of movement and accessibility at the time. For many of you, you have never lived in a world where Palestinians and Israelis supposedly coexisted. Obviously, there was still second-class citizenship, and yet during the time frame of the first Intifada, while settler terrorism was of course occurring, there was still freedom of movement, as far as I understand it, between what we now know as Israel proper, West Bank, and Gaza, right? So
yeah,
that is why I think it's important to recognize that the more conditions have worsened for Palestinians, the more casualties have increased on both sides. But of course, there's still a massive asymmetry there. And the protest methods have changed as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's, this is the nature of a military occupation or a counterinsurgency, which is that, it gives the illusion, when successful, of stability. You think that everything is peaceful. You think that everything is, proceeding as normal and that there is some kind of equilibrium being maintained. When in reality, what is happening is a constant level of, a daily level of violence, but it is just organized and carried out by the state. And I think in the case of, what happened, especially after the first Intifada, the freedom of movement of Palestinians afterwards became vastly more restricted. And over the course of Oslo, over the course of this process by which Palestinians would supposedly be getting, their state and something resembling political equality as a result of the, laying down their arms and so on, they got nothing. And in fact, they got less. They watched their land get stolen. They saw Israeli settlements rise. They, sat through, a few different right-wing prime ministers, and they launch a second Intifada that allows for, it justifies and they allow suicide bombers. And this is depending on, I interviewed the Tamimi family, famously Ahed Tamimi, her father, when I interviewed him in his living room, he said that he believed that was a tactical mistake in hindsight, but that he did not believe that it was morally wrong when you considered the, fundamentally, the fundamentally subjugated position of Palestinians. And that was, I think, broadly speaking, how a lot of people, I don't think that he was alone or is unusual in thinking that. So when this handbook comes out, the second Intifada and suicide bombing, really, it's a moment not all that similar to our own right now, because also it's not just the second Intifada and trying to explain why are Palestinians blowing up Sbarros in Jerusalem. They were, it was also in the aftermath of 9/11. And there was this, rising, conception, especially in the Western world, that the Islamic threat was, international and something that faced all of us. So it was a shared endeavor. So the Hasbara handbook, I think, is also all of which is to say that it's a really I'm glad you sent it to me, just because it's a good distillation of how in an earlier generation, when in a not totally dissimilar moment, the Israeli government with a huge number of resources, supported both the Israeli government and also wealthy Jewish American philanthropists, as it sort of lays out in the intro. It offers a bit of a roadmap for how these people, I think, are going to try and explain the same, to argue against the same kinds of, all the same tropes and all the same shit that they were doing 20 years ago. It's going to be the same thing.
This was perfectly illustrated by that professor emeritus at Harvard. I remember we watched it yesterday, Chad. Do you still have it? Where she talks about how Israelis are called to action to serve in the IDF, and American Jews must serve as well, a different kind of battle, a battle online. Do you have the video?
I need this video.
Yeah, I want to show it to you. It was Mohammed El Kurd posted it. Where is it? Harvard professor blames American Jews for Israel's failures. Oh, here it is. It's a 2-minute video. We can play it real quick. I'll send it to you on Discord. You can watch it on your own end. Yeah. And I'm gonna pee while it plays because I think it perfectly brings us into the thing that we're talking about now. You will say what? You want us to make you look good?
Ruth Weiss.
That's not my job. Your job is to make us look good. Our job is not to make you look good, American Jews. What do you have to worry about? Your job is to make us look good. And here's how you do it. Every one of us has to serve 3 years in the Army, 2 years in the Army, some of us 5 years, and then for the rest of our lives, you have got to serve 2 or 3 years in the army of words. You've got to learn to fight the political battle, which is even more important at this point than the military battle that we are. We'll fight the military battle. We're not asking you necessarily to come and be lone soldiers, although some of you can. You've got to learn how to fight back on the campuses, how to make the arguments. Now, they keep shifting. The ground keeps shifting under us. They keep changing the language. Intersectionality wasn't even a word 10 years ago. Now suddenly it's intersectionality. You've got to stay on top of it. And you know how we train for the Army? We don't train for defensive warfare. If the war against Israel ever had to be fought on Israeli soil, do I have to tell you? It's an impossibility. So it's the same thing. Don't let the war of words ever be fought about Israel's nature. Let it be fought about why you can't accept Israel, why you have to single out this tiny people. Try to find Israel on the map. It's hardly there. We used to play this game, Where's Waldo? Where is Waldo on the map? Are you going to really tell me that this is the country you want to blame? Teach them how to defend by attacking. Teach them really what one says as in fencing. You've got to make demands on them. They've got to serve for 3 years in the army of words.
In the army of words, they got to serve for 3 years. And that's how that ends. So this is a continuation of that, or rather just another moment where that has never stopped, the war of words, rather. And I think that it's been relatively successful. Obviously,
we shouldn't give the impression. So Ruth, she's a literature scholar, and she's like she has dined out on having worked at Harvard for like her entire life. And she's like a total crank, like a total right-wing nutter. And I'm kind of glad that people are discovering, because there's a whole bunch of kind of great grandmotherly right-winger Jews. Like Lucy Davidovitz is a famous one. Midge Decter, who is the mother of noted street boy John Podhoretz. It's actually quite a fantastic archetype, in my opinion. But we should get to the House of Rob, because there's a whole lot of them.
Yeah. So the reluctance of Jewish students to get behind Israel unconditionally is probably connected to the gradual shift in our generation towards attempting to find personal meaning in Judaism. Very few young Jews will do things merely because a Jewish organization or authority mandates them. We are individuals looking to enrich our lives. This Hasbara handbook attempts to acknowledge all of this whilst providing Jewish students with the tools to defend Israel as a country in an intelligent and thinking way. It also says, of course, Israel's not a perfect nation, right? That's kind of how it starts. Are there any? You looked at this. Is there anything that you want to get started off with?
Well, I think there was one thing about that was called point scoring and genuine debate, which I thought was like a really interesting, because I don't know, it seems kind of clear that it's lifted from the rules of formal debate, where they actually score it according to how many points you get it, how many things you're able to say. And whether or not your opponents will have time to rebut them. But it is really, so it's this thing where this chapter, it's, I guess, being proactive and promoting Israel. And then it kind of goes on. It's actually the opening part of this whole pamphlet. And I think it's the most kind of jarring one to me, because the rest of it is really just about how to be annoying. It's just
how to be a debate pervert.
Yeah, exactly. But this is this is beyond that. This is beyond debate perversion. This is here is how you actively sandbag people who are trying to talk about human atrocities that our government bankrolls, it feels a little bit like those, when you're reading those FBI handbooks for how to be an agent provocateur, disrupt the meeting with as many irrelevant points as possible and so on.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I want to cover it, because it's my favorite thing, because it's so entirely and utterly unproductive, and this basically acknowledges that these sorts of conversations are always going to be unproductive, so you should figure out ways by copy pasting some of these talking points and shift it literally gives you a manual to deflect, which is really interesting.
I will say, and I think that's also there's there's a point related there to, I think, about good internet hygiene, which is that you shouldn't just believe that debates and venues for discussion are just places to try and manipulate or annoy people into your position or whatever. It's fun to rag on people, whatever. But if you are taking seriously the idea in a specific venue of you could there are people here I can win over, then it kind of behooves oneself to think about then, well, all right, how do I go about doing that? Whereas this is listen, you're going to have to take it for granted that sometimes you're going to be in a room with people who are lesser beings. And if you're in a room with people who are lesser beings, then you're going to have to learn how to, manipulate their minds. And so what does that mean? Well, it literally, here's one subhead. People believe what they hear first. Uncritical audiences believe something if they hear it first and hear it often. People tend to believe the first thing they hear about a certain issue. That's Neil Strauss, The Game shit. Like that,
Yeah.
like they're trying, like, is that Hasbara or is that trying to teach you how to like pick up a woman at a bar? Like, it feels like such like, it's elemental, but this stuff this stuff was pedagogy for Jewish students in college campuses and, educational settings around the country, through this day. So this is also like, I'm expressing like, oh my gosh, can you believe this? But like, I probably got a version of it at one or various points in my youth.
Yeah. Agenda setting. Why be proactive? The person who sets the agenda will usually win the debate. Reactivity forces Israel activists to be constantly on the defensive. No, Israel is not all that bad. However, by setting the agenda, Israel activists get to determine what to talk about and can therefore discuss the things they feel help promote the pro-Israel message. Which, by the way, is, of course, the same thing that I talk about quite frequently on this broadcast, where the message, the talking points come directly from like the American Enterprise Institute and make its way all the way down from mainstream media, Fox News, politicians, and independent YouTube channels down to the last Republican person that was in my chat that repeated the talking point, which is, of course, why I always say, you debate one guy, you're debating all the guys in the Republican in the conservative reactionary side. And a similar thing could be said about this as well, where the talking points are identical all the way from American politicians to IDF commanders to Ben Shapiro. It's always the same exact talking points, which I want to address through the PragerU video, unless you have more that you want to talk about.
I think the PragerU video is actually kind of a better one because it's a really good example of just like how like selective framing is sort of part and parcel of everything that they do.
So without further ado, let's get to that. PragerU, why isn't there a Palestinian state? Let me see if we can like watch this together. I think I'm going to turn off my camera, turn it back on the stream side. And then I will share my screen with you instead, and then we can watch it together. Hold on, and then turn on camera. Not share your screen. Oh, here it is. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it, so let me know if you can. Put you over here. Hold on, resizing your beautiful face. Okay. As best as I can. All right.
If Israel just allowed the Palestinians to have a state of their own, there would be peace in the Middle East.
You can tell me to stop it whenever.
That's what you hear from UN ambassadors, European diplomats, and most college professors. But what if I told you that Israel has already offered the Palestinians a state of their own, and not just once, but on 5 separate occasions?
All right, pause here. So the first thing that he does, aside from just, that's an incredible, David, okay, I'm going to call him David Blog.
Okay.
David, so, and the Maccabee Task Force is like, I have no idea what that is. And damn, he looks kind of faded right now. Anyway, so David Blog is saying the Israelis offered the Palestinians this, like they offered them a state 5 times. The Israelis did not offer the Palestinians the state like seriously once, but that's kind of beside the point. Like the Israelis in the first example he will go on to give were not, Israel didn't exist at that time. So already he's beginning with cap. Continue.
So yeah, that is a very common talking point that you hear always, is that Palestinians actually never had a state. There was no like historic Palestine formation whatsoever, and that it was under Ottoman mandate and then British mandate, and the British offered Israelis the entire area known as Israel, including the West Bank and Gaza. And Israelis actually did a really nice gesture to the Palestinians by giving them Gaza and the West Bank. That was the first time Palestinians ever had any kind of autonomy or any kind of government formation. Is like a really cynical way to present this ahistorical perspective. I don't know if you've ever seen that one at all. Have you? Maybe you haven't heard this propaganda before. No one can hear me?
Oh, wait, sorry. Repeat that. I didn't hear the last part.
Oh, I said that the you know how the map that everybody uses all the time, showing like how little territory Palestinians had remaining, that shows like the West Bank getting smaller and smaller. Yeah. The counter to that from the Israeli government is always to claim that Palestinians never had any kind of governmental authority until Israel kindly gave them Gaza and the West Bank in like 2005 when they pulled out of Gaza. And that's the first time Palestinians ever even had a government. And that before that it was the Ottoman mandate, and then it was the British mandate. And the British gave Israel proper, like the entire Israel land to the Jewish people.
A very imperfect analogy, but it really is actually, I think it stands up, which is that, like, yeah, it's like saying, oh yeah, slave owners gave the slaves freedom. Like, it's like, no, that's not like the Israeli government. It gave them limited political authority that they conceded at the negotiating table after administering a military government for many, many years. I think a really good documentary for your listeners is also, the English title of it, it's called The Law in These Parts, and it's all about the military courts that the Israelis ran. Like, I mean, the Palestinians had a government. It's just one where they have no rights. They could be put in prison indefinitely for any reason. And, if their water goes out, or if they can't, if they build in the wrong place, then it'll be an Israeli bulldozer that comes and deals with the fucking problem by just getting rid of the whole thing. I mean, you're not talking about, and from the period of 48 to 67, the Jordanian military wasn't exactly a picnic to deal with either for the Palestinians. I mean, it's not like the counter to that map thing is like a pretty, part of what the map also illustrates, I think, is like, we were talking about earlier, just the complete diminishing of Palestinian movement and control over that limited amount of territory. So it's also like, it's not just about how like Palestinians have actually lost land, because they already lost that land. It's about how like, they're allowed to do even less and less and less with the shit that they got.
Yeah. The Jewish population after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire was 11%. What are we talking about here? What do you mean? Yeah, no one says that Jewish people were not coexisting peacefully under historic Palestine alongside Muslims and Christians. That is an objective fact. Yes, Israel, it's in its state formation, or historic Palestine, belongs to the Ottoman Empire. You are correct, Chatter. It was objectively better back then. Okay, let's continue. That's what they need to do. They need to restore. They need to restore Yugoslavia, and they need to restore historic Palestine under Ottoman mandate.
Absolutely, that'll fix everything.
Yes, and Crimea also belongs to the Ottomans.
We're bringing back all the different inter-ethnic republic ideas. Fuck it.
Yes. Okay, that's the last time I will mention the Balkans. Okay, let's continue. What David Blog has to say.
Don't believe me? Let's review the record. After the breakup of the Ottoman Empire following World War I, Britain took control of most of the Middle East, including the area that constitutes modern Israel. 17 years later, in 1936, the Arabs rebelled against the British and against their Jewish neighbors.
All right, you took a deep breath, so I paused it.
Well, so the map that he says there. So the first thing is that like the Arab revolt, they rebelled against the British and their Jewish neighbors. That's one way of putting it. Another way of putting it is that like the Arabs revolted against the British, and then the British counterinsurgency, resulted in like the wanton slaughter of many Arabs and Jews who began increasingly, vying for their own political influence. And the rightists were ascendant during this time through their various gangs. Hannah Arendt describes it very well for Western readers. But I mean, the other thing was this map where it's just like, oh, so they have a little sliver there that you can see that's like the Gaza Strip, but it's not under this border, because it's like treating Gaza as if it's like a foreign place, as opposed to, it's like a very subtle way of saying like, yeah, Israel doesn't have authority over this thing. So, as if it's like alien territory and not like a situation in a place that Israel in its totality pretty much controls.
Yeah. That's kind of them. It's kind of them to show the West Bank as well, and partition it.
I am sure that like the 30-year-old like design person who used like a magic pen to like draw that dotted line also was really like keeping it fidelity.
Do they also? Am I crazy? Is this Golan Heights?
Up there at the top with the blue? Yeah, that's the Golan.
Wait, isn't Golan Heights just beyond even any borders? Like it's just simply Syrian land that Israel has annexed illegally.
Now it's, and Israel's annexed it. Like I believe, I'm pretty sure now that it's just like it's formally part. I mean, that's part of why, like, unlike Gaza, for example. I mean, like it's kind of funny. You have like 3 different stages of Pokemon here because you have like the Golan Heights, which is just now a part of Israel. And then you have the West Bank, which is kind of a part of Israel and even has 3 different territory designations by itself within the West Bank. And then you have the Gaza Strip, which is just like, fucking like is a sort of like okay, like the most extreme kind of policing in a sense, which is to say we're going to choke it off completely, and the only governance that they're going to be allowed to have essentially because of our design will be this like inept Islamist group.
Yeah. All right,
6.
let's continue.
The Arabs rebelled against the British and against their Jewish neighbors.
Not good.
The British formed a task force, the Peel Commission, to study the cause of the rebellion.
He looks like Dr. Manhattan.
Yeah.
The commission concluded that the reason for the violence was that 2 peoples, Jews and Arabs, wanted to govern the same land.
I
mean, it's like, I think here's a good article. I'll send you a good link about the Peel partition that I liked a lot. Whoops, that's just your Twitch link.
Me back my Twitch stream.
Yeah, it's oops. No, wow, and now I'm just sending you the number from the end of this link. All right, there we go.
Okay.
So it was really about like this article it does a nice job. It's an academic thing, but it shows that like for one thing, like the Arabs had like almost no input on this process. It was really like the Peel Commission was as like anti-democratic a method of like going about this as like one could have done. And it was really not about like, like when you say like studying the causes of the Arab revolt, it's like, okay, well, this is the study of like, how are we then going to manage it further? And the decision that they chose was to, do what this article calls cantonization, which is basically, like I think a more accurate way of describing this is not 2 states or 2 peoples, but divide and conquer. Because, this is like the twilight of the British Empire, obviously, but like the British colonial interest was trying to figure out how do we, it was about balance and positioning for what, would ultimately be like, well, if there are states to come about, we want to make sure that they're ones that serve our interests. And it was, extremely classically British to basically, wherever their empire had been, to just leave 2 rival ethnic groups in different, polities that fucking hate each other. Like it's what happened in Pakistan and India with the partition. It's just like the story of the British Empire is a series of goodbye presents like that.
Yeah. Divide and conquer. It's a very successful, and even Hamas's creation is a continuation of that same exact policy, but this time in the hands of the colonial force being the settler colonial force of the Israeli government, right? I mean, Hamas being used as a counterweight and being propped up was done with the express purpose of trying to divide Palestinians and offering more power to the Islamist factions as a counterweight to more secular formations, Marxists and the like, to rid the PLO of its influence and power.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's an interview or an article by the former Jerusalem bureau chief of the Times. It was in Washington Monthly a few years ago, where he interviews like a former Israeli colonel who had been, one of the guys who basically first gave money to people who would form the organization that became Hamas because they wanted to weaken the PLO, and it's like, yeah, I mean, there's a little podcast called Blowback, whose 4th season on Afghanistan describes a sort of similar process by which that, created a lot of problems for the U.S. government down the line and resulted in another catastrophic attack. It's a crummy podcast anyway.
All right. Let's continue with the Peel Commission.
The answer, the Peel Commission concluded, would be to create 2 independent states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs. A 2-state solution. The suggested split was heavily in favor of the Arabs.
What?
The British offered them 80%
All right, wait, look,
of the
all
disputed
right,
territory.
pause this. All right, I want everybody to look at this map. How much of that do you think is the arable land there?
Yeah.
And also, by the way, how many Arabs do you think lived in that territory that has also now just been designated to the Jews? Okay, it's a very, this is where to me, like, the Peel map is like a really kind of like it's sort of like clearly designed. Again, this is like classic Brit stuff, right? Like, these are 2 states that, like, one of them had way more of a shot, in particular because of the massive amount of aid they got. To actually have, like, a viable shot at development, whereas the other state is incredibly, would be incredibly limited and compromised with its natural resources and, like, what it would actually be able to accomplish. No, I mean, ultimately, I think it's like,
ultimately, it doesn't even matter.
This is 80-20. This is 80-20 fairness. Oh,
yeah.
And also, but ultimately, he reverses. He does another thing with, like, the color screen is all fucked up because he's saying that those are Arab states, and then the blue is also Israel, but then it's also the other Arab countries.
Yeah. So ultimately, none of that matters, though, because even the areas where, like,
sorry, this graphic design is fucking me up.
Yeah, even the areas where, like, agricultural production could happen potentially in the West Bank were immediately seized by the Israeli government in an, of course, unlawful, completely unjustified, completely illegal act later on, regardless. So whatever viable areas remained, they took over anyway, even on the supposedly Arab state side. So that's interesting that they brought it up.
The Jews, the remaining 20%. Yet, despite the tiny size...
Here it is. This was what was happening. This was the remain.
There's the real, like, kind of historical comparison here that kind of emerges is what's called, like, the so-called Free City of Leipzig. That was, like, a huge sticking point in the lead up to World War II. And, it was this idea of, like, all right, trying to wrap your head way, like these kinds of international control or British control things. Like, the idea, right, is that when the British mandate ends, this would be given as a trusteeship to, some international body or something. And I think in the case of this, it's sort of like, this is like a great example of, like, how to bastardize what often, what could actually be a pretty good idea to ensure, like meaningful political equality. And of course, like, it's sort of poisoned from the beginning when the Peel Commission is using it as, like, sort of clear cover to essentially, like, neuter the possibility of, like, a viable development for a future Palestinian state.
Yeah.
Of their proposed state, the Jews voted to accept this offer.
Oh, before I forget, I'm running a 3-minute ad break now, chat. Sorry, but we'll continue. Of course, if you're subscribed, you will see it uninterrupted. Or if you're living in an area where there's no ads. So let's continue.
But the Arabs rejected it and resumed their violent rebellion. Rejection.
The Jews voted it. Arabs rejected it.
10 years later,
number one.
In 1947, the British asked the United Nations to find a new solution to the continuing tensions. Like the Peel Commission, the UN decided that the best way to resolve the conflict was to divide the land. In November 1947, the UN voted to create 2 states. Again, the Jews accepted the offer, and again, the Arabs rejected it.
Yeah, what happened there? Some other stuff happened in that process, I feel like, that he's just kind of skipping a little bit, especially after this the 1947 boundaries.
Well, so I think the first thing with the 1947 is that this is a great example of the difference between an actual explanation for something and then the retroactive justification for something. So it's during this time, of course, that, like, a lot of governments are experiencing the horrors of the Holocaust and so on, and they're justifying what is, like saying, well, we're all supporting this process because we feel guilty for the Jews who just suffered this thing. And, that was surely a sentiment. But in reality, what I think you can sort of pretty clearly see here, is that the way that this map was drawn up and the way that this process, guided the U.S. and the West unfolded was part of this effort, this, this continuing game at this point organized through the UN to make sure that there wasn't the capacity for an organized, Arab world, to put it bluntly. Palestinian. I think in the case of Palestinians, one of the other moments in the history of the Palestinian national movement, also, again, this is, I think there's a focusing on this vote is also, I think, in the historical memory of American Jews, and how American Jews won this state and they also got this. It ignores the gradual process by which Palestinians were getting their land stolen, and to which land had been was being, that they were conscious of the potential for massive depopulation. And so I think that there is this, a kind of you could say, oh, well, the whole UN voted for it and it was a good thing, right? And it's well, the whole UN voted to help invade Iraq. They got that one through. So, it's not always a sign that something was necessarily a good decision. And, Arab countries all invaded, not because they had evil in their hearts, but because I think it's, there is a, in the same way that we're now seeing in the present day, there is actually a shared sense of, Arab solidarity that back in those days was becoming much more powerful. The early days of growth, of course, people think of the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. But, obviously, I'm thinking most of Pan-Arabism. This moment is kind of part of the crucible through which that movement is born.
This must be analyzed through the framework of Arab nations themselves going through their post-colonial nationalist movements in an effort to develop their statehood and independent identity after being subjects of the Ottoman Empire, which was, again, probably more favorable than the British one, but still not having their unique identity, and then being a part of French and the British empires as well. So, right? Am I wrong about that? Historically speaking, I feel like that plays a role in this as well.
What, the subjection of Arabs under these different empires?
Yes.
Yeah, it's. I think that's sort of in Israel-Palestine. The thing that gets lost in a lot of this context is that there is a regional and global game that the Americans were sort of beginning to play as part of Cold War strategy, and that meant picking winners and picking losers. And if somebody gets to be powerful, then that means that there's certain parties around them that have to be weak. And in the case of Palestine, I think that this is part of it's a common thread in Palestinian thought, not as a sort of woe is me thing, but to describe Palestinians as losers. I think it's really to describe the process by which basically in the process of organizing the post-world order, obviously they were in a Gulf state, and so they lost tremendously, and their cause never became even as Arab identity took root and the Palestinian cause remained, the principal ostensible organizing cause of so much of the Arab and Muslim world. It was the basis for a lot of the the Arab oil embargoes in the 1970s. Geopolitical, it was it was a real and live current then, but ultimately those countries, leverage the power of Palestine and the justification of Palestine for their own personal advantages. So yeah, it's the anti-colonial sort of glue that could have held these countries or this cause together was ultimately, it was never really allowed to be formed because the process of decolonization as it was, or post-colonization as it was really about neo-colonization and about making sure that these systems could assimilate or be absorbed.
But I feel like we're also skipping a step here though, because we haven't even gotten to the Nakba yet. This is 1947.
Yes.
So let's get back to PragerU saying the Jews accepted the offer, the United Nations and the Arabs rejected
Only this
it.
time they did so by launching an all-out war. Rejection number 2. Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria joined the conflict, but they failed. Israel won the war and got on with the business of building a new nation.
They're
okay. So yeah, the thing that they kind of just sort of skip over there is the fact that they just like dispossessed all of Palestine. There were massacres, there were expulsions. The Israeli government lied about it. We still learn about massacres all the time. About the, I mean, literally the beach in Tel Aviv. There was once a Palestinian village there that was eradicated in 48.
Mass rapes, mass displacement, murders, imprisonment. All of these things happened with British and Zionist forces. It was already boiling up, and this was basically the straw that broke the camel's back. And again, the Tantura massacre is one that we covered before. One thing to also consider here, PragerU is not getting too far into the nitty gritty that like you will hear from other supporters of the Israeli state development. Is always half the time it's a disagreement on whether it happened at all, or if it did happen, it was good. And depending on how right-wing the Israeli person you're talking to, it should happen more often and more frequently, and should happen to Gaza and West Bank as well. And some of the more common talking points you hear even in this community is when they say, well, they delivered pamphlets beforehand. Like, which is kind of like the classic, well, Israel is the most moral army on the planet. That's why they do the door knocking bombs before they drop an entire city block or an apartment.
Israel also has the argument, right, about like why does Israel has like this insanely robust military legal system, and they also have they have this guy Moshe Halberstal who wrote like a moral code of conduct for the army, and then Leon Wieseltier in the New Republic many years ago gave let him like orgasm all over the page about how great and unique it made Israel as the most moral army and all that. But why is it that you build those things, one might ask? And it's like, well, it's because you know that what you're doing is unconscionable, and that you've got to build all of these edifices on top of it so that you don't ever actually come to grips with like what it is that you're doing. So you create a military court system that allows the good liberals or even socialist Zionists, as they see themselves, who participate in it, to remove themselves from the totality of what there is that they're doing. I think to me that's the kind of like that shows the truth of their morality. But yeah, and also in the case of 48 and the Nakba, they've the experience of the reason that they that Krieger, et cetera, all these people move on from it. Is that also within Israel, 48 was not it was a victory. It was an achievement. Of course, they established the nation, but it was not like 1967, 19 years later, where, which was actually because after 48,
wait, before we get there, wait, hold on. No, one more thing I have to mention again. I mentioned the pamphlets. Another talking point also is that these people were voluntarily dispossessed, that they actually chose to leave their homes and, of course, bring their keys with them as well. That is another talking point as well. That is an abject lie, obviously, but it is one that you frequently encounter as well, where like, oh, well, technically you're saying that there was ethnic cleansing here, ethnic displacement, but like Palestinians voluntarily left their homes during the Nakba as well, which is disgusting. It's both what it's describing and presenting as voluntary is obviously coerced, and it's also just a broad lie. I mean, like we know that people were told to leave. We know that Ben Gurion, specifically the prime minister, held up as sort of a liberal founding father of the state, actively encouraged and wanted to make sure that Palestinians would be forced out. They saw this as a land grab. It was there was no. I think that I will say this. I do not think that they viewed, I think over time they came to understand the gravity of what they had done and how controversial it would be if they'd ever opened up to it at the beginning. But I don't necessarily think that as actors, there was they viewed like this was not extraordinary to them. This was what like fulfilling the mission meant. This was what they wanted to do. It required a level of dehumanization that, sort of became a kind of building block piece, a kind of like an animus, a racialized animus that became a cornerstone of the state.
You know, it required, for example, and it, like there are millions of Arab Jews. There are so many. Israel is not a majority origin country of people who come from Europe by any means, and so the experience of all of those people in their own home countries when they came to Israel, when geopolitics made it so that these people could no longer live side by side with the neighbors that they'd had for many years and so on. It required, sort of figuring out like, oh, all right, like, what is this new ideology? What are we going to get these people to subscribe to and so on? And it involved, I think, in a lot of ways, developing this kind of trying to think of how to put it, this fixation with sort of representing, I guess, a version in Israel that was sanctified and had to do all these things, and you make everybody buy into that myth, even if they don't have a reason to, they don't have any reason or basis for it. Like, there's no reason for a Baghdadi Jew whose family has now showed up in Israel to have to be brought, to be bought into the cause that just a few years earlier had resulted in the theft of land from Palestinians. But there, over the course of up into '67, that was part of what the Israeli state building project included.
Yeah. Well, not just Baghdad, Jews in Baghdad, but also, of course, Russian and Ukrainian Jews as well.
I mean, they were the Pale of Settlement Jews and like the German, like there were earlier waves of European immigration. Then there was the post-Holocaust and during the Holocaust waves of immigration. I mean, Israel is a country that's been shaped by its successive waves of immigration in ways that have altered the character of the country multiple times. And it has never been, because Israel, it's a Zionist country. It has never been. These waves of immigration have never really adulterated the, again, like the fundamental catastrophe, the Nakba, on which the country is based.
There is an Orthodox Jewish person in here who lived in Israel for a while. He said Zionism is the most successful land-back movement in history, and then followed it up with genocide is when population triples. Yeah, which is ironic because like that is a Nazi talking point. You know what I mean? That's like, in my opinion, and that is no different than like, well, in the camps they had showers because that wasn't for like mass murder or whatever. Like, how could you claim these numbers are real? They literally doing that specifically while defending the apartheid state. It is so gross. You can say that my comparison is anti-Semitic all day, every day if you want, but it is literally what you're doing. Disgusting.
Let's keep going with the propaganda.
What do you have for Zionism is the most successful land-back movement in history? I mean, 2,000 years. 2,000 years. 2,000 years.
I just think that like if you view Jewish history as a 2,000-year struggle to get back like a bunch of land in the Middle East, and like that sucks because like
it also doesn't make sense.
I mean, forgetting it doesn't make sense. None of that, like that, but that's beside the point. Like that, it doesn't make sense. Everyone knows, like that's up front. What is nuts about it is the idea that like there is actually, like what it requires is shunting aside a much more interesting and nuanced, and like meaningful history into like this teleology that's all about getting us to Israel. And it's like, all right, great, that's settler colonialism. That's just fucking, like that's That's wonderful. In 200 years, I'm sure we'll be doing land acknowledgements. As Corey Robbins said this, it's like in 200 years, we'll be doing land acknowledgements to acknowledge the fact that we did take this land from Palestinians, if we're lucky, if the Israelis are involved.
100%. Absolutely. Absolutely. Where, I mean, obviously that argument makes no sense for many different points, but like it's also not widely shared by early Zionists either, including, as far as I understand, Theodore Herzl, who thought about other lands as well, and not specifically just Israel. Israel being the main one, obviously.
The most famous one is Uganda, where like there had been like one floated. But I mean, you know, it's kind of like I don't really think that they could have pulled off a Zionism in Africa, just because it's like. Is like, you know, part of the basis for why it was plausible that you could convince Jews to go to Israel was that, like, well, get this, you know, we recite all these prayers and we talk about the destruction of the temple and how we have to go back to the land. Like, was, you know, I mean, part of like the genius of Herzl was that, like, he took a very, and you know, part of why he's such a popular figure in the Zionist imagination, why Herzl is considered the father of it, not just for, you know, convening like Zionist congresses and stuff, but it was because he was not a religious guy at all. He was called a political Zionist, which meant that in his instance, he really thought about Zionism as a solution to the problem that Jews faced of anti-Semitism in Europe. And the idea, you know, and for that to be a successful idea, you had to figure out, like, well, how can I reach these people? How can I, you know, touch them? And it's like, well, there happens to be this place in this land to which we can, you know, we can tell these myths. Like Tel Aviv, for example, the name Tel Aviv in Israel of that city it's a reference to a book by Herzl called Alt Neuland, which means old new land. And the whole idea of you know, somebody like him was to be able to, you know, like the you know, you could argue the genius or the, you know, the ultimate fantasy that he provided was to say, look, like, we can take this thing that, you know, is been disused or whatever, you know, obviously a fundamentally racist assumption, and we can resolve our dilemma by going back to our roots like this. And it was, you know, an adaptation of European nationalisms at the time that were, you know, are saying similar things about the ties between people and their lands, because nationalism was incredibly in vogue then. I mean, you know, it's a, you know, there's a, I think it's to me at least, it's a, you know, like it's the craziness of the 2,000-year story should be something that should be the object of like a really interesting inquiry of like, well, how did the idea become so captivating, rather than just like something that people repeat blandly as like, oh yeah, well, Israel has well, I just checked, and the Jewish property deed, the pink slip for Israel is 2,000 years. What's Palestine got? You know, like, that's bullshit. That's not real anyway. So let's just not. It's not even engaged.
It's a part of myth making. I think like it's more so a post hoc rationalization, of course. Even though, like you also pointed out, Theodore Herzl and early Zionist leaders routinely recognized that this was supposed to be a colonial project. I read something about I think it was Herzl talking to the founders of Rhodesia, saying like this is a united struggle. That it would be similar. It's closer to Manifest Destiny than it is a land back movement, certainly. But it's not like people were hiding that the Palestinians were not going to peacefully be dispossessed of their homes and displaced.
I mean,
they were not oblivious.
There were many people in the early days of the Zionist movement or of the Israeli state, like the most famous of them being the guy named Judah Magnus, who was the first president of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who, you know, believed in a binational state. They believed in a singular political entity. American Jews, by and large, until the 6-Day War, because the 6-Day War in the 60s, like sort of Israel's victory there made it to a lot of Americans just seem like, okay, it's here for real. Like it's not going anywhere. They can hold their own. And there were people like Magnus who, you know, like they thought like, you know, like this isn't a tenable situation, and they lost. I mean, unequivocally, and in no small measure, that's not just because of you know, the people like Ben Gurion who were in power and in the government and so on, but also because a huge chunk of Israeli society that did not get to hold power meaningfully in government until the 1970s were the reactionaries, the right-wingers, the most violent people, the intellectual, and in some cases literal forefathers of the current right-wingers. Who are, you know, helping to run the show in Israel now. And these are people who I would argue, I think their influence is definitely continued to be understated here.
Yeah. Can't believe how much we strayed away from the main point of contention here, but Israel won the war and got on with the business of building a new nation. Let's see.
Most of the land set aside by the UN for an Arab state, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, became occupied territory. Occupied not by Israel, but by Jordan. 20 years later, in 1967, the Arabs, led this time by Egypt and joined by Syria and Jordan, once again sought to destroy the Jewish state.
I like that they did conveniently ignore the Nakba, of course, but you have to do that, right?
Or like the fact that there was a bunch of negotiations ongoing that Israel was instigating about do these people deserve to come back to their homes? Can we let them do that?
Yeah.
That's it's just we're gonna skip past that.
That, by the way, a refusal of the right to return for Palestinians is, I think, I don't know what your personal experience being Jewish, I don't know what your personal journey was to come into terms with this anti-Zionist opinion, but I think that as far as I understand, at least some more prominent anti-Zionist scholars and more prominent anti-Zionist speakers will always talk about the refusal of a right to return to Palestinians being a major point of contention, despite having originally, despite feeling very excited about building a Jewish nation state, especially after World War II, recognizing that, having friends and knowing people that are Palestinian who are dispossessed and not allowed, even though their families have lived there for, hundreds of years, whereas some American Jewish person or a Jewish person anywhere around the world could just go and live in any part of Israel that they want, including territories that Israel is currently occupying, is an illuminating moment for many American Jews, or just Jewish people not living in Israel, or even Israeli Jews, I guess.
Yeah, and it's also so that's exactly right. So the right of return for Palestinians is a two-sided issue. The first is that Israelis, or rather Jews around the world, if they can prove to the Israeli state that they are sufficiently Jewish, and there are parameters and there have been court cases, obviously, as you can imagine, kind of delineating who's a Jew and who's not. The one that I would suggest to your audience to Google is the Brother Daniel case, which is kind of, I think, the canonical one. It's about a Jew who converted and it became, I believe, either a pastor, a priest, or a monk. Anyway, and so the Jews have a right of return where they can just go to Israel and hang out, and settle, become, they can move to the settlements if they want, they can do whatever. But
and it's encouraged.
It's the idea
course.
Of this Jewish homeland is that. So yeah, and they have a whole structure for it. The idea immigrating to Israel in Hebrew means the phrase to immigrate to Israel in Hebrew is la'alot, which means to go up. And what it refers to is in the days 2,000 years ago, when there was a temple. There was the Temple Mount, in Jerusalem. The Jews would go up to the temple to make sacrifices. And so when somebody leaves Israel and they emigrate from Israel, it means they're called Yordim, which means people who leave or fell down or go down.
Yeah, people immigrating to Israel are returning, right? That's what it's considered.
Well, it's exactly they're returning. It's framed and put into this 2,000-year process. The idea of we are giving a state structure to Jewish peoplehood. Please don't ever think about who it's constituted on. And then the other half of the right of return issue is that Palestinians cannot go home. They cannot go home. And the Palestinians who are in the West Bank, you will have people who've spent their whole lives on a village on a hill in Palestine, and on clear days they can see a Mediterranean Sea that they'll never be able to visit. It is the denial of the right of return requires the complete, these days, especially, a sealing of Palestine or sealing off of Israel from Palestinians. So people who had homes prior to 48, prior to 60, or who maybe even left, border regions in 48 and 67. So people who were in Israel proper and who had stayed there, but lived in, a more, gray area region, let's say, they left their homes in 67 because they didn't know what was going to happen. And now they can't go back. So either, it's Jews enjoy the privilege of effectively unlimited access to Israel with the, support of the state, while Palestinians, they can't even go. They can't even so much look at their shit in person, and the dispossession is ongoing. I mean, people can look up the videos of what happens in Silwan. It's the neighborhood in Jerusalem, or Sheikh Jarrah, more famously, where you'll have some a Jewish guy from Brooklyn being like, "Listen, I'm sorry, your problem, it's not with me. I have just stolen your home, yes, but it's not my problem." And then it's like, and you have a Palestinian family wailing with all their shit in the street because their home of 4 generations is now in the hands of, like Shmuley from Midwood. And it's that's what right of return amounts to.
Yeah,
like
a lot of far right American Jews are some of the most rabid settlers, all the way from, Baruch Goldstein was American too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of the word. That's it's the zeal of a convert. He wasn't literally a convert, but it's part of what makes these. I would argue it's very wound up with the settler colonial thing, where it's people who come to this place, who do come to this place from, if I were to have made Aliyah, it's like you already are coming in at a place of inflamed and heightened passion. So they're they become overrepresented in both terrorist acts and, as activists in this cause.
Would you say that a similar radicalization occurs amongst formerly ethnically undermined Mizrahi Jews that become really far right, more radical parts of?
There's a fact that I was told many years ago that has always stuck with me, which was about a survey done of Israeli high school youth, and it asked them, how many times a day or how often do you think about the Holocaust? And I don't remember the exact responses, about how many it was, but what I remember was the relative difference between Mizrahi Jews and Ashkenazic Jews, and how Mizrahi Jews thought about Sephardic Jews in Israel, so people whose backgrounds are from, Morocco, or even, actually not Sephardic. Sephardic Jews, in Greece, for example, they did suffer the Holocaust. But really, Jews from Yemen, Morocco, Iraq, Iran, how these Jews, they thought about the Holocaust more. And you could argue that it was because, there's a phrase that Holocaust scholars in Israel came up with, which was to say that the Holocaust is, in a critical lens, to say that the Holocaust is Israel's civil religion. And so, the feeling of having to compensate for not having, experienced the Holocaust yourself, but being subject to this, induction into, again, a civil religion made for Mizrahi Jews, that is the explanation in part for why Mizrahi Jews, think about it or feel the need to prove, themselves that much more to a myth, which was, it is, perhaps somewhat alien to them, not, because it's, they can't relate to that horror or anything like that, but simply because they didn't come to Israel because they, their parents were, caught between Nazis and death, or they had survived Birkenau or something.
Survivor's guilt.
Yeah, essentially.
Well, I've heard this from even the notion of survivor's guilt being experienced by Holocaust survivors as well. That they survive the Holocaust rather than perish alongside their family members. But I don't know how widely spread that opinion is, or if it's more like a spiritual. This is a terrifying event, like a world-changing event. So, it makes sense. It makes sense to have that if you were not, not a part of the Holocaust, if you were not rounded up in concentration camps.
Someone
said envying the dead. Someone said, envying the dead is not uncommon for Holocaust survivors.
There's also, I think, another, I can't believe I'm quoting this guy, but it's a line that stuck with me for many years. I read it in his memoir. But Christopher Hitchens once said that, people on the fringe of an identity cling the most tightly to it. And I think that there's some wisdom in that. If the Israeli, the new Jew, which is, by the way, the image of a muscular kind of Zionist Jew, in contrast to the pathetic continental European Jewish weakling that emerges out of, working the land and all this shit in Israel. You know, like that's the cultural, you know, if you know, like that's the Israeli, like Gary Cooper, John Wayne, you know, image. And if you are not somebody who like resembles that, you know, in the 1950s, a lot of Mizrahi Jews came up in what were called ma'abarot, which were these, and there were, you know, movies made about them, even some comedies about the difficulty of adjusting from, you know, like living life as, you know, an Arab Jew in the sense to moving into these, you know, essentially these camps where they were going to be trained on how to live as Israelis. And the culture clash was really, you know, quite substantial. And, you know, I think that this is kind of, you could view this, you know, sort of like fierce nationalism as part of what they had to inculcate in people as part of the process to assimilate them into this ideal.
Exactly.
Or to accept this ideal.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect that's a perfect representation, I think, or a perfect way to try to analyze where some of the more radical elements come from sometimes within Mizrahi Jewish people. Okay, so 1967, Arabs are trying to destroy the Jewish state.
The 1967 conflict, known as the Six-Day War, ended in a stunning victory for Israel. Jerusalem and the West Bank, as well as the area known as the Gaza Strip, fell into Israel's hands.
Oh, they fell into Israel's hands. They were dropped there by accident. A bird was flying overhead.
You don't understand. They had to do it to him. They had to do it to him. They had to do it to him for the one time.
Over what to do with this new territory.
Yeah, they were split. They were really confused. They
Half
were like,
wanted
to
return the West Bank to Jordan and Gaza to Egypt in exchange for peace. The other half wanted to give it to the region's Arabs, who had begun referring to themselves as the Palestinians in the hope that they would ultimately build their own state there.
But go
on. That's 1967 is the first time people...
This is a huge trope. It's still very popular in the right wing. I see it all the time about how like Palestinians had no identity, that like the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, like in Nablus, those Palestinians and Arabs have no connections to one another. In fact, Gazans care, you know, they're retired more to Egypt. So all that's bullshit. Like that's just like right wing revisionist claptrap. That is, you know, like writers for Tablet magazine or something repeating stuff that they read in books by people who don't speak the language or have any interest in developing an authority, but obviously just want to make shit up about how Arabs could never have developed, you know, sophisticated European style nationalism,
including Jewish people also that lived in historic Palestine. But
yeah, absolutely,
but it's really funny
as participating in a culture that was, you know, like included Arabs. You know, they perhaps many of them viewed themselves as Jews who were a minority in historic Palestine in what was obviously, you know, an Arab society.
Yeah. One funny, but also albeit disgusting way to reframe this is also by like, by the supreme eminence of the intellectual and much smarter, much more superior Jewish state, carefully acknowledged the existence of Palestinians for the first time in 1967. Like it's very supremacist. It's very disgusting to just like analyze it from that framework. But he just like drops it in there. It's no different than saying Palestinians have never had self-governance until the Jewish state of Israel gave them self-governance. And look what they've done with that. That's why they live in sewage, the Ben Shapiro line. You know, good stuff.
Neither initiative got very far. A few months later, the Arab League met in Sudan and issued its infamous 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. Again, a 2-state solution was dismissed by the Arabs, making this rejection number 3.
There wasn't a there's not an there wasn't an offer. No offer. You're just saying it was a preemptive rejection, so you're calling it a rejection, which is like not all right, just keep playing. That's all there is to say about that.
Okay.
It's a rhetorical sleight of hand.
Yeah. So, I mean, throughout this history, the 5 times, which is again very common propaganda talking point, like not a single one was like a legitimate, genuine offer. It was always done at gunpoint for the most part, or under the auspices of occupation, in an effort to continue said occupation and only make it worse and worse year over year. Especially like the closer we get to current present time, the more you recognize that reality, especially when like there's a lot of documentation on everything as well.
Yeah.
In 2000, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud
Right
Barak
there.
met at Camp David with Palestinian Liberation Organization Chairman Yasser Arafat to conclude a new two-state plan. Barak offered Arafat a Palestinian state in all of Gaza and 94% of the West Bank.
What do you think about this one?
All right, 1 second. One moment. I'm pulling up a good link.
Okay, I'll pull it up.
Yeah, 1 second.
94% of the West Bank. So what happened?
So I'm sending you a link.
No, I know. I'm saying, like, what happened? Where is it?
Yeah, right. So there's
the books, Camp David, The Tragedy of Errors.
So, oh fuck! It's a. I'm going to send you the archive, the unpaywall.
Let me see if I can. Let me see if I can get through it. Nope, I cannot get through it with.
I got you.
Ad block.
You can with the archive. 1 second. All right, use this one. It's about Robert Malley, it's by Robert Malley, who's recently pushed out of the Biden administration.
Okay, while you explain this, by the way, I got to go pee again real quick. Sorry.
Yeah. So this article kind of lays out what I think is kind of the definitive perspective from somebody who was, on the U.S. side, that what really felt the breakdown in negotiations came from Israel, and that essentially, rather than Israel making an offer at Camp David that the Palestinians could seriously accept, the Israeli side was so unwilling to make the political sacrifices necessary to put an offer forward that the Palestinians could accept, that the talks broke down. Or rather, the offer came and there was no basis for a path forward. And then the Israeli domestic political situation exploded with the rise of Ariel Sharon and this, is the provocations to send the Palestinians into the street as the talks broke down pretty definitively, or rather had broken down before. And I think that, for your viewers, the people who are still listening here while Hasan is taking a whiz, that this article, if you want to read it, kind of lays out pretty straightforwardly the failures at Camp David and to whom they can be attributed. Trying to see.
There's also this as well.
Oh yeah, there we go.
This Guardian article talking about Israel spurning Palestinian offer of biggest Yerushalayim in history. Leaked papers reveal negotiators proposed concessions on East Jerusalem settlements, Sheikh Jarrah, and Old City holy sites quietly, and the Palestinian Authority leaders privately discussed giving up part of the Flashpoint Arab neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, according to leaked documents, and they proposed a joint committee to take over the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount holy sites in the Old City of Jerusalem, the highly sensitive issue that, along with refugee rights, sank the Camp David talks in 2000 and triggered the Second Palestinian Intifada. So this is what you're referencing, right? I mean, this is part of what you're referencing, I think,
yes.
Right?
I mean, essentially, yes. And we've gotten this article that I just shared was published in August of 1. So we've learned many, many things since then. But part of the reason I wanted to I shared this link was because it was so fresh at the time, and meaning that this talking point that Israel gave Palestinians the deal of the century was as you can imagine, a misrepresentation of how talks had broken down, and that the Israelis and Palestinians just had they wanted fundamentally different things at the table. Which, by the way, is sort of is really, and I have a pretty good idea of what the next rejections are that the Mr. PragerU goes for, or David Blog goes to explain, because it does just come down to if you're going to make an offer that there's no chance of being accepted because it's part of you're operating on cloud nine, and there's no world of concessions that you would ever make that the Palestinians would accept, and there's no world in which what the Palestinians want is something that you would give. You could just say that, every time you don't come to an agreement, it was a rejection. It comes down to framing, really. It is a kind of weasel word sort of thing. But let's go on and see how he tries to continue spreading this.
Do you also?
Because the other thing, by the way, these land swaps. Also, I will say he offers it on all the 9% historical whatever, but like left unresolved. In addition to Jerusalem, by the way, and this issue was right of return, of course, and these other issues. Like there was not enough progress made in resolving what were the other major political sticking points that were not just the land, which was still, by the way, by itself not resolved.
And also, at every single step of this, at every single step of the way, Israel has maintained its occupation, and therefore, in an effort of showing good faith, could have absolutely followed along by force if they wanted to these conditions that were seen as favorable at the time that I guess like the Palestinians simply rejected. So that part is also very silly ultimately. Like there is no saying Palestinians rejected these offers and that's why we just have to continue partitioning the West Bank is idiotic. Like I think it's ridiculous. Oh, hold on. All right, my mom made me food.
Oh, nice. Lucky you. I got to go get dinner soon.
Okay. We'll burn through the remaining 2 minutes hopefully.
Yeah.
But okay.
With East Jerusalem as its capital. But the Palestinian leader rejected the offer. In the words of U.S. President Bill Clinton, Arafat was...
Also, there's no mention of the Oslo Accords. You notice he skipped from 1967 to 2000.
The only reason that these talks are happening is because the Bush the Bush 1 administration forced Israel to Madrid, and then it's like a whole it's obviously collapsing the whole history by which like Israel was strong-armed to be at the table in the first place, and then they take the one pithy thing Bill Clinton said about it to give them a soundbite that they can flagellate to death until there is no more Palestine left.
Yeah. I mean, if you present it like this, it seems real fucked up, man. Seems like these Palestinians didn't know what was good for them when Israel was so kind enough to say, hey, I know we like took all this land from you and displaced you from said land with another occupying force, but why do you keep saying no to these good deals that we keep offering you? It's kind of fucked up. Yeah.
You're 14 days and said no to everything. Instead, the Palestinians launched a bloody wave of suicide bombings that killed over 1,000 Israelis
yeah, we went into that
and
earlier.
maimed thousands more on buses, in wedding halls, and in pizza parlors. Rejection number 4. In 2008, Israel tried yet again. Prime Minister Ehud Olmert went even further than Ehud Barak had, expanding the peace offer.
This is the funniest part about this, of course, is that like at this point, settlements are a constant, and it is like West Bank is fully occupied. Now restriction of movement has taken place fully. Like this is like post 1994 in the 2000s at this point, like before Gaza. Before Israel completely withdraws from Gaza, forcibly taking settlers, forcibly removing Jewish settlers in Gaza at gunpoint so that they could completely close it off to the rest of the world. They already started restricting movement and partitioning off the West Bank that had occupied illegally. And was doing what B'Tselem called the permit tyranny.
I just sent you a link on the. This
I clicked on it.
Thing.
Abbas never said no to 2008 peace deal.
And scroll down also to when he did say that, like Abbas said that he rejected it later, like in 2015. It's because like he couldn't look at like so. Like I don't think that really quite contradicts what Olmert is saying so much as like he's saying that he wouldn't. I mean, for one thing, by the way, Palestinian leaders have a lot of incentives, and as well as Israeli leaders, to reject a lot of the leaked plans that come out or to distance themselves from that. Because why would you want to be the guy associated with giving something up when the deal didn't work out? Why would you want to be associated with a concession thing? So I think like a bit of grain of salt on that point. But I think that what this illustrates is that like the 2008 thing ended up breaking down because of geopolitics. Like there was no actual incentive to get a deal done. And Olmert was in an extremely rickety position. He was not. I mean, he ended up being prosecuted afterward because of corruption from the time that he was Jerusalem mayor. And Olmert ended up, he was like, he went to great pains later. Like, we learned about how he said Abbas rejected this because he gave an interview to the New Republic in which he emphasized that these talks have potential down the line. And so that's rejection, I guess. I mean, I'm curious, is that number 4 number? I don't understand if like this is number 4 that we're going to, or if there's yet another rejection that we have to learn about.
I don't understand it either.
Include additional land to sweeten the deal. Like his predecessor,
additional land.
The new Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas, turned the deal down. Rejection number 5. In between these last 2 Israeli offers, Israel unilaterally left Gaza, giving the Palestinians complete control there.
Okay, that is just a lie. That's a lie. Like, Palestinians do not have complete control.
No, that's the worst one, but that's the one that is off repeated, where it's like,
yes,
it's a literal fucking concentration camp. They've ghettoized the West Bank, okay,
and the disengagement is also like, it was a. So basically, in the mid-2000s, there were really not that many settlements in Gaza. Like, you're talking about fewer than 10,000 people, I believe. Versus the West Bank, which is, at this point, millions.
Why didn't they do the same thing in West Bank, you think?
Well, I mean, it's because the reality is, because in the West Bank, if you look at like a map and it's like, where do Jews live and where do Arabs live? It's like they're all mixed together. And so the nature of occupation is about maintaining separation between Jews and Palestinians.
Those settlements also deliberately were placed so that the Palestinian land that Palestinians lived in were partitioned off from one another as well. And the roads that were built around it, and then of course the actual walls that were erected specifically were designed in a deliberate way to make sure that there was no contiguity between any of the areas where Arabs lived in the West Bank, which, by the way, for those of you at home, and I cannot stress this enough, is recognized as Palestinian land given to the Palestinians that Israel is currently illegally occupying. This goes beyond the Israel nation-state formation. This is just a complete destruction of international laws in our supposed liberal rule-based order.
Absolutely. And in this case, with the disengagement, it's this open air prison and all this other, all these other things, but it enabled, in a sense, what they gave, Ariel Sharon, who was the prime minister at the time that they oversaw it, he was no dummy. And he was extremely not a softie. He had been the defense minister who had been in office at the time in '82 of the murder of the massacres of Sabra and Shatila. So he was a hardliner. And so, this is this maneuver, which everybody said, would go down a disaster. It actually went off, it was very clean. The effect of it is that it essentially allowed Israel to, in response to the election of Hamas, to basically say, whatever goes on there is their problem. And whatever they do to us is their fault. And it basically, it became, it was a huge strategic advance. It was a huge strategic advance. And, it benefits from the fact that, Judea and Samaria, as the Israelis call them, there are more real and quote unquote real, there are biblical references that you could point to about why you want to be in this hilltop or this mountaintop. But Gaza did not have that kind of historical connection, or not historical, rather biblical connection to Jews. And I think that it was the kind of extreme, almost dorm room level thinking about we'll give the settlers the West Bank, and then we'll let the Arabs run their have their mess in Gaza. And we will continue to, as to use the phrase that Netanyahu used, a few years ago in a private meeting, he would just decide how high the flames would get.
Oh yeah, that what you're talking about. Also, I brought up before, but it is from a 2019 closed door meeting in Likud, where he openly states that any effort to thwart a Palestinian nation-state development must be by using Hamas as the real counterbalance, and propping up Hamas as like the equal partner, right? Like all Palestinian nation state development projects should be pointed back to Hamas, completely neutering the Palestinian Authority, which, you know, at least publicly they were supposedly collaborating with.
Yeah.
Something along those lines. I paraphrased it a little bit. That was, but that was a deliberate attempt to show Hamas as the singular force for Palestinians, the only group that is to be reckoned with when you are talking about Palestinian rights or Palestinian needs, Palestinian interests. And that was done specifically so that you could show the rest of the world that it is justifiable to continue your bombing campaign and ethnic displacement. Because look, these guys, the only people that they like are these Islamist fundamentalists who look at them. They can't even hold a nation state together. Of course, they're omitting key details there with it being a fucking concentration camp. But, you know, that was by design, which I think has played a role, in my opinion, in getting more and more Palestinians to also start seeing that as the reality that Hamas is the only option remaining.
Yes.
Because while they were doing that deliberately behind closed door meetings, they were also very openly acting like they were collaborating with the Palestinian Authority while simultaneously undermining the Palestinian Authority. So what did the West Bank, what did the Palestinian Authority have to show for the West Bank? You can't get construction permits. Your land has been partitioned into oblivion. You have more and more checkpoints propping up. You have an apartheid system that is glaringly obvious. You have two different license plates to go through certain roads, and you can't go to where the Israeli roads are, even though that's technically supposed to be your land that Israel is occupying. And of course, the only way to justify that existence was through strict military mandate and have the only form of policing be an occupying force that bullies you, humiliates you, and defends violent settlers who spit on you, throw trash at you, and sometimes even kill you and get away with it. Of course, the people of the Palestinian people who remain in historical Palestine are going to look at that situation and go, why the fuck are we even collaborating with the Israeli state when they've given us zero security assurances and all they've done is stolen our land and partitioned it and made us feel unsafe in our own homes, that some dude from Brooklyn can come in and just like take over on a moment's notice, on a whim.
Let's ride this one out so that I can go make some dinner and not lose my appetite. Continue with this one.
Instead of developing this territory for the good of its citizens, the Palestinians turned Gaza into a terrorist base from which they have fired thousands of rockets into Israel. Each time Israel has agreed to a Palestinian state, the Palestinians have rejected the offer, often violently. So if you're interested in peace in the Middle East, maybe the answer is not to pressure Israel to make yet another offer of a state to the Palestinians. Maybe the answer is to pressure the Palestinians to finally accept the existence of a Jewish state. I'm David Brog, Executive Director of the Maccabee Task Force for Prager University.
Yeah. It's to let Israel do, the same slow ethnic cleansing campaign and mass displacement campaign that they've engaged in.
Yeah, David Blog, you are officially disinvited from the Jewish cookout.
Mm-hmm.
You are no longer, do not expect to see you there. You're cooked. You're done.
Fucked up. No, thank you so much for coming on.
This was my pleasure. It felt really good to talk about all this and to do it for your lovely viewers. Before I go, I would like to plug my podcast, Blowback, www.blowback.show. Please sign up and subscribe. You can listen to the first episode right now wherever you get your podcasts. And stay tuned for, I guess I'll try to write an article or something as events unfold. But I would just make a last appeal to your listeners, if they're able to donate I'll give a couple names of groups that I think are worthy in a moment. Just pull them up.